The whispers in Europe's corridors of power are growing louder, echoing through the marble halls and bustling meeting rooms of Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. Is it time for Europe to stand on its own, to chart a course independent of old certainties and external influences? Recent shifts in America's security priorities and its evolving Ukraine policy have jolted European leaders, forcing them to confront uncomfortable questions about the continent's future. The once unquestioned transatlantic bond, which for decades seemed unbreakable, is now under scrutiny as never before. Strategic autonomy, once an academic term debated in think tanks, has become a political rallying cry, echoing in parliaments and public squares across the continent. For decades, the US was Europe's security guarantor, its military presence a reassuring constant. But the world is changing, and so are the expectations on both sides of the Atlantic. Some now wonder if America will always be there as expected, or if shifting domestic priorities might one day leave Europe to fend for itself. This uncertainty has triggered a deep rethink within the EU. Is relying so heavily on Washington sustainable in the long run, or is it a risk Europe can no longer afford? The debate is no longer if Europe should be more independent, but how to achieve it, what steps must be taken, and how quickly. The stakes are high, not just for Europe, but for the global order built since W1. The choices made now will ripple far beyond the continent's borders. This isn't about hostility toward America. Most European leaders still value the alliance deeply, recognizing the shared history and common values that bind the two sides. But there's a growing sense that Europe must mature, take more responsibility for its own destiny, and develop the tools to act independently when necessary. In a multipolar world, Europe can't afford to outsource its security or economic future. The challenges ahead, geopolitical, economic, and technological, demand a new level of self-reliance. The goal isn't to sever ties, but to rebalance the relationship, transforming dependency into partnership, and ensuring both sides can stand strong together. The answers to these questions will shape Europe's future for generations, influencing not just policy, but the very identity of what it means to be European in the 21st century. The time for a new European Declaration of Independence may be closer than ever, an era where Europe stands tall, united, and ready to define its own path. The desire for European independence is real, and it's a topic that's gaining more attention than ever before, but the path toward true autonomy is fraught with challenges, both old and new, that make progress slow and complicated. EU member states have different histories, economies, and security concerns, which shape their priorities and make unity difficult. For example, Eastern Europeans see the US as essential protection against Russia, relying on American military support for their security. Meanwhile, France and others in Western Europe push for greater autonomy, hoping to reduce reliance on outside powers. This persistent East-West divide makes consensus elusive, as leaders struggle to find common ground on key issues. Economically, Europe and America are deeply intertwined, each other's largest trade and investment partners with supply chains that cross the Atlantic. Millions of jobs on both sides of the ocean depend on this relationship, making any attempt at decoupling risky and potentially disruptive. Leaders must weigh the dream of long-term autonomy against the reality of short-term economic pain and political backlash. Then there's the question of capability. Can Europe realistically replace what the US provides in defense, intelligence, and technology? America's military and tech dominance can't be replicated overnight, and Europe faces a steep learning curve. Building true independence requires massive investment, political unity, and above all, patience and time. Simply deciding to be independent isn't enough. Europe must build the real-world capacity, infrastructure, and expertise to make it happen. The scale of the task is monumental, involving not just policy changes but a transformation of entire industries and mindsets. The debate is not just about ambition, but about overcoming deep-rooted dependencies that have shaped Europe for decades, and that won't disappear overnight. Europe's journey toward true autonomy is built on three essential pillars: economy, security, and politics. Each of these pillars is vital, and together they form the backbone of Europe's future independence and influence on the world stage. First, the economy. Europe must not only strengthen its internal market, but also foster innovation, invest in new technologies, and reduce critical dependencies on external suppliers. Building economic resilience means supporting local industries and ensuring supply chains are robust and adaptable. Second, security. Building credible European defense goes beyond increasing budgets. It demands joint procurement, shared intelligence, and a unified strategic culture. Europe must develop the capacity to respond rapidly to threats, both traditional and emerging, and work together to protect its citizens. Europe must be able to manage crises in its own neighborhood, whether these are military, humanitarian, or cyber in nature, and do so with or without US assistance. Third, political strategy. Europe needs not just the will, but also the effective mechanisms to act decisively and swiftly. This requires unity among member states and the ability to overcome bureaucratic hurdles. This means protecting democracy from foreign interference, strengthening the rule of law, and reforming slow EU decision-making processes to make them more agile and responsive. These pillars are deeply interconnected. Economic strength provides the resources for defense, credible defense enhances Europe's political influence, and agile politics ensures both can be leveraged effectively. Progress in one area naturally reinforces the others, creating a virtuous cycle of growth, security, and unity. A successful strategy must address all three pillars in concert, guided by a clear and ambitious plan for the future. Only by working together on all fronts can Europe hope to achieve true strategic autonomy and shape its own destiny. The challenge now is to turn these pillars into a solid foundation for a new era, one where Europe stands strong, united, and ready to lead. The EU and US share one of the world's largest economic relationships, but it's not as balanced as it seems. The EU runs a significant trade surplus with America, selling far more than it buys. This surplus makes Europe more dependent on US market access than vice versa. If political tensions rise, US tariffs or barriers would hit Europe harder. This economic leverage limits Europe's foreign policy independence. The dependency goes deeper. Europe relies on American technology, digital platforms, and the US dollar. American financial markets and tech giants dominate globally. For Europe to achieve economic autonomy, it must address not just trade imbalances, but also its reliance on US tech and finance. These vulnerabilities shape Europe's options on the world stage. Reducing them is essential for true independence. The challenge is to rebalance without undermining prosperity. Europe's economic future depends on it. To reduce reliance on the US, Europe needs a multi-pronged economic strategy. First, boost domestic demand. Shift from export-driven growth to a more self-sustaining model. Completing the single market and raising wages can help. Second, diversify trade partners. Strengthen ties with Asia, Latin America, and Africa. New trade agreements spread risk and increase flexibility. Third, build a unified European capital market, the Capital Markets Union. This would channel savings into investments, support innovation, and reduce reliance on Wall Street and the dollar. These steps aren't about isolation, but about resilience and balance. By strengthening internal foundations and broadening partnerships, Europe can build a more independent economy. This blueprint is key to economic sovereignty. A stronger, more balanced Europe benefits the global system as well. For decades, Europe's security has depended on the US and NATO. American troops, intelligence, and nuclear deterrence have kept the peace. The war in Ukraine exposed just how deep this reliance runs. Without US leadership, Europe's military response would be far weaker. NATO's command, structure, and key capabilities are overwhelmingly American. This dependence limits Europe's strategic voice and autonomy. The debate now: how can Europe build real strength and become a true security partner? Reducing military dependence on the US requires action on three fronts. First, European nations must commit to higher, sustained defense spending. Second, they need deeper cooperation, joint procurement, and standardization to eliminate inefficiency. Third, Europe must invest in its own defense industry, prioritizing homegrown technology over American imports. These steps will create a stronger, more integrated European defense. The goal isn't to replace NATO, but to build a robust European pillar within it. Europe must share more of the security burden and be able to act independently when needed. A new doctrine means Europe is not just a consumer of security, but a capable producer. This shift will rebalance the transatlantic partnership. Only then can Europe truly defend its own interests. Economic and military autonomy mean little without political unity and resilience. Europe must defend its democracy from foreign interference, especially online. Stronger regulations for social media and digital platforms are essential. Internally, the EU's slow, unanimous decision-making is a weakness. Moving to qualified majority voting in foreign policy would make Europe more agile. Reform is sensitive, but necessary for a credible global voice. Only with faster, unified decisions can Europe respond to crises and shape its destiny. Political reform is the final piece of true autonomy. Europe's quest for autonomy is a generational challenge, sparked by shifting US priorities. Success depends on a unified strategy, economic strength, security capability, and political reform. Europe must rebalance its economy, invest in defense, and streamline decision-making. These steps will transform dependency into partnership. By weaving these strategies together, the EU can forge a new identity. Europe can become a sovereign, stable partner to the US, and a global power in its own right. The future of Europe and the world order may depend on it.